To another session, and indeed this is probably, as described, the first real debate with a proposition and an opposition and a vote, and of course your say as well. And before we get to that, I just want to say a big thank you to the sponsors of this session. They're not here today, but it's a sponsor that's helping us put on debates around the UK. The first one started last month in Lincoln, and we'll be going across the UK to cathedral cities and university towns, and of course lovely areas of the country such as Bournemouth, to be with your good selves and debate the substance of Magna Carta in and around the 21st century, and of course in specific sectors of society. And today we're talking about trade. Looking out the window there, you have a lovely blue sea onto the open sea of the world, and of course Magna Carta was influential in certain ways. But the question today is whether it's relevant to 21st century trade. And for that we have Ted Broman to discuss and debate this. We have Ted Broman, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. You may have heard him speak earlier this morning. And we have Rupert Matthews, campaign author, historian, speaker of note, and also campaign manager of the Better Off Out campaign. And first, the motion is Magna Carta is relevant in the 21st century. I would like to hear Ted Broman making the proposition case, and everyone, if we can welcome Ted to the stage.
Thank you. It's again a pleasure to be back at the Freedom Association Freedom Festival for the second year. I feel I'm rather outmanned in comparison to Rupert. I merely work at the Heritage Foundation, and he is an author, campaign manager, speaker of note. This seems like a bit much for one man to have. But I shall do my best. Let me just start by conceding something that I'm sure that my opponent is going to press on me in any case. There's unquestionably large, very large chunks of the Magna Carta that are not particularly relevant to today's society, to trade, to many other things. I personally have fallen far behind in my scuddage payments. I'm not sure how the rest of the audience stands, but it's been some years since I contributed anything in that form of payment. So there is a lot that we can pass over about Magna Carta, but there is one particular clause, one part of Magna Carta that I think is vitally important to a lot of areas of society and to trade, domestic and international. And that's the portion of Magna Carta, and I'm sure you all know it as well or better than I do, that guarantees due process. This is an absolutely vital part of trade, because the essential aspect of due process, legal due process, is that you can't be deprived of your property without due process of law. And there are lots of ways to be deprived of property. Now, the simple ones are fairly obvious. It can simply be taken from you by force. We would call that thievery. But there are lots of other ways that you can be relieved of your property. You can be taxed. My libertarian friends would say that's also an act of force. And perhaps it is, but at least the force is separated from the removal of the object by a distance. You can be inflated out of your property. Right? That's as real a theft from your pocket as physical theft or taxation is a loss of your property. You can be, if you're an investor, you can be nationalized. That's another variety of the removal of property without consent. Now, there are lots of ways that governments, and of course also malicious individuals, can act to relieve you of your property, or in the worst case, even your life. How can trade be conducted if there is no security of property? It's inconceivable. So, domestically and internationally, we've developed a lot of mechanisms to ensure, not perfectly, I would certainly agree, but to provide property with more assurance and more due process than it would otherwise have, that have made trade absolutely essential. Domestically, I won't go into all of the things that the British government does, or the American government does, or other nations do to protect property, as well, of course, as the many things that they do, unfortunately, to take property away. But there is reasonable security of contract. There is reasonable protection against theft. There is reasonable assurance that investments will not be expropriated or nationalized domestically. How do we address these things internationally? When you look at the United States and the United Kingdom and many European countries as well, and some others, you'll see that there are mechanisms usually taking the form of international arbitration tribunals that are set up in terms of a treaty, trade treaty or investment treaty done between two or more nations, that are designed very specifically to look at disputes. Say one government is trying to nationalize property, that's against the terms of the treaty. It's depriving someone of their legitimate property, and it's an offense against the treaty, so the case will be arbitrated internationally. Now, it doesn't absolutely stop governments from doing things. I would certainly concede that. But what it does mean is that investors, business people, if the system works properly, and it frequently does, will be compensated from the assets of the government, which will be taken from assets held abroad. There was a very interesting case recently, about a year or so ago, where American investors pursuing Argentina after one of its many defaults convinced an African nation that they should seize a portion of the Argentine Navy. Yes, there still is actually an Argentine Navy. It's fairly small now. That docked in an African port, and it should be sold off to recompense the investors who had bought Argentine government bonds, which had then predictably been defaulted upon. So there are mechanisms that have been developed, even internationally, that can even work against governments, all of which are designed not, in my view, to infringe on national sovereignty, because governments are still free, unfortunately, to do stupid things, but they can't do stupid things against property without paying a price. And that, to me, means that international trade is one of the few areas of international relations that actually works more or less as it's designed to work. Most trade treaties are actually respected most of the time. That's partly because they offer mutual benefits, so there's a market-based incentive for people to do the right thing, but it's also because there's an enforcement mechanism set up to ensure the sanctity of contracts and investments and to ensure that governments can't expropriate people. Now, those institutions have taken a long time to develop, they're still developing, and of course, as a conservative, I always want to watch institutions like this to make sure that they're not taking away infringing on national sovereignty, infringing on people's freedoms. It's always worth thinking about these things and being concerned about them. But when I think about trade, my first concern is, can owners of property conduct it with reasonable security? The way to do that is to have the rule of law, and the way to have the rule of law is to have, in a domestic context, due process, and in international context, because some governments and some court systems cannot be relied on, to have an arbitration system which at least provides recompense to investors who are maltreated against the commitments that the governments have freely made. So yes, a lot of Magna Carta is not terribly relevant to today's trading conditions, but without the rule of law, there can be no secure trade, and the essence, the surviving modern essence of the Magna Carta is the rule of law. So I therefore argue that the Magna Carta and the principle that it enunciated is vitally important to trade, both domestic and international, even in today's world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's the first thing. Thank you for coming along. Okay, I'm going to start by agreeing almost completely with what my opposite number here has said, and then I'm going to explain in some detail why he's in fact wrong. I'm going to start by making a couple of general points about Magna Carta, and then I'm going to talk about business in particular as it's reflected in Magna Carta and what was going on at the time. And the first thing to say is that when people are reading Magna Carta and looking at Magna Carta, they very often look at it in isolation and don't really put it into the context of the time. So I have actually taken the trouble to make a note of the one clause which talks about trade in Magna Carta. A lot of it's about feudal dues or feudal obligations, which, as you quite rightly say, have absolutely no relevance at all. Okay, so clause 41 talks about, and here is what it says: all merchants may enter or leave England unharmed and without fear, and may stay or travel within it by land or by water for purposes of trade, free from all illegal extractions, in accordance with the ancient and lawful customs. And that's really all it says about trade. But the phrase I want to pick up, and this is a phrase which is repeated time and time and time again within Magna Carta, is the phrase in accordance with ancient and lawful customs. Because what Magna Carta was, it wasn't really an innovative document. It wasn't a document that was introducing very much at all in the way of new laws or new rights. What it was doing was putting down in writing for the first time laws and rights which all freeborn Englishmen, and of course back in those days there were such things as slaves and so on, but all freeborn Englishmen had enjoyed for centuries, but which wicked King John was trying to get around and trying to strip Englishmen of. And this clause is absolutely typical. What it's saying is that merchants can travel, they can trade anywhere in England, they can go abroad, they can come back from abroad, whatever they want to do, just as they always used to. That is a key point, because the conflict which arose and which led to Magna Carta was, and this has got some echoes in modern Britain, and of course, as you quite rightly say, I'm campaigns manager at Better Off Out, so I'm going to draw a very obvious analogy here. King John came from the royal dynasty of Anjou, which is now just a part of France, but was then a virtually independent small state within the larger France. And he came to this country, and what he tried to do, as his father had been wise enough not to try to do, was to impose the Angevin concept of rulership and concept of government onto the English state. And it was particularly this that led eventually to Magna Carta, because King John was trying to introduce foreign customs, foreign laws, foreign ways of doing government. And the English didn't like it. And that's basically what this was all about. Habeas corpus is quite often cited as coming from Magna Carta. No, it didn't. It's first written down in modern terms in Magna Carta, but we know that the concept that you cannot be put in prison without lawful trial by your peers originated in this country certainly 300 years earlier, and in the context in which it is mentioned then, it is being mentioned as being an ancient right of all freeborn men. So quite clearly it was a lot older than that. And the same applies to these clauses to do with merchants and to do with trade. Magna Carta isn't introducing anything new. It quite specifically says, in accordance with ancient and lawful customs. All it's trying to do is to make King John stick to what had previously been, if you like, the unwritten laws, or the case law as it was called then. It's now called common law, but the case law as it was called then. But the other thing I want to bring in here, specifically to do with trade and with merchants, is the way in which trade and the economy then was so completely different to today, that really anything written about trade and so on back in the early 13th century can have at best very limited resonance today, and in some ways is absolutely by the point. First point to make is that more than 90% of what we would now call GDP, obviously terms like that hadn't been invented back then, but 90% of the GDP of England in 1215 was agriculture. It wasn't trade. Anything that we now consider as foreign trade, manufacturing, service industries and so on, that all accounted for less than 10% of GDP. It accounted for something like 6% of the working population. And this is why vast amounts of Magna Carta, of course, are talking about farming and fishing and all the rest of it, because that was what was economically important. Another thing to bear in mind is that this is way beyond, or before rather, any of the modern thinking about commerce, thinking about the economy got going. I mean, Adam Smith was 500 years after Magna Carta. So Magna Carta to Adam Smith was twice as far into the past for him as he is to us. That gives you some idea of the gulf in time. And so nobody had even, formulated the idea of free trade. Nobody talked about it because nobody had even thought of it. And those people who were engaged in trade back in the early 13th century were in fact engaged in a very closed, protectionist type of trade in which they sought to establish cartels, they sought to establish monopolies, and they sought to establish ways in which to rip off their customers and to stop any sort of outside competition coming in. This is what the guilds were all about. Every town had its guild of cobblers or its guild of silversmiths or whatever. And you couldn't become a cobbler in Exeter without passing the exams set by the Guild of Cobblers in Exeter. Just because you'd passed all the tests and exams of the Guild of Cobblers in London meant nothing. You could not work as a cobbler. It was illegal to make or repair shoes in Exeter unless you were approved by the Guild of Cobblers in Exeter. And this was dressed up later on, when these things were coming under pressure. It was dressed up as a sort of a quality control, where all the customer can be certain that you're getting a well-made shoe because this cobbler's passed the test in Exeter. It wasn't. This was all about restricting trade, about restricting the number of people who could make shoes, and therefore they could charge higher prices for shoes. And the whole basis of international trade was carried on with the same sort of mindset. This business about merchants being able to travel abroad, that wasn't about free trade. What that was about was controlling the people who were allowed to go abroad, because those who went abroad had to be approved by the markets and fairs that they were going to. And you, sir, as an English merchant, couldn't just go to France and say, I've got some lovely shoes, they're all made by them cobblers in Exeter, they're marvellous. You weren't allowed to do that. If you wanted to go abroad with English goods of any kind and said, you had to be approved by the market or the fair that you were going to. And again, this is building up a cartel. You wanted to restrict the number of English merchants approved to go to, let's say, the great fairs in Champagne or the leather markets at Lubeck. Not because you wanted to ensure that the stuff you were taking was of superior quality and to maintain the prestige of English leatherwork. No, you wanted to be the only one going so you could charge the high prices you wanted to set and make a nice fat profit. Okay? And that is the whole mindset of how trade was carried out in the early 13th century. So pretty much any of the laws that were passed then can have only really very restricted use today. Only by twisting the meaning of the words can we think that anything Magna Carta says about trade is relevant today, because trade then was very, very unimportant. It was a minuscule amount of GDP. It was an even smaller amount of government revenues, because government wasn't really taxing trade very much compared to today. And in any case, the people carrying out the trade were a complete bunch of protectionist, loan shark type merchants who were only interested in screwing the customer and making as much money as possible for themselves. So while, as I say, I do agree with pretty much everything that Ted here has said, the relevance to the reality of trade in the year 1215 is so limited as to actually virtually be meaningless. Thank you.
Well, those were highly engaging statements. I would just like to point out that our sponsors, the Federalist Society, and to give them the full name, Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy, are very well acquainted with the legal aspects of Magna Carta and the Constitution. They are an association of conservative lawyers. And I thank both sides of the argument for actually going towards the legal arguments and looking into the due process policy, as well as the idea of trade and, of course, its origins as well, as, of course, legal origins are important, and language as well. But opening up to the floor, what does everyone else think? Are there concerns regarding Magna Carta and trade, or indeed trade in the 21st century at all that Magna Carta might have solved if implemented properly.
Concern, really, because it wasn't such a worry when we made our own laws, but now we're being encouraged, like the habeas corpus, to get rid of them by people who don't understand our ways, and I hope they will never understand them. That is really my main concern. I mean, Magna Carta does, as you said, depend very much on the status quo. Whereas now, unless we come out of Europe to a certain extent at least, we are not in control of our own well-being.
Well, would either side of the argument like to propose or comment on that?
Well, I would argue that far from being excessively gloomy, you're probably unduly optimistic. Unfortunately, except for every single person in this room and the two people at this table in particular, I yield to no one in this room for my lack of enthusiasm for the European Union. But unfortunately, Britain does a lot of regulation of itself. And I fully seize the desirability of Britain leaving the European Union, but if the reaction to leaving the European Union is to reimpose all of the EU's laws and then a few more that people find desirable, undoubtedly a great achievement of sovereignty will have been won, but I'm not sure a whole lot of economic liberty will have been gained. So, you know, Magna Carta is a wonderful document, and leaving the European Union is a consummation devoutly to be desired. But if you want to have something like a spirit of a modern Magna Carta, leaving the European Union is at best only an indispensable first step. If it's not done in the spirit of outward-looking, optimistic, lowercase l liberalism, I'm not fully sure I see the point.
Okay, well, I'm going to straight away plunge into history. The reason why habeas corpus made it into Magna Carta and why it was given the prominence it was because of a great cause célèbre which occurred a couple of years earlier. A nobleman by the name of William de Braose was disputing his tax bill with King John. He thought that King John was trying to charge him too much tax. And King John, in retaliation, sent a bunch of armed soldiers who grabbed William de Brose's wife and 2 children and threw them into prison, and he said, well, you're not getting your family back until you pay your tax bill. Now, this was, of course, according to English law, against the law. According to Angevin law, it was in accordance with the law. So you had a classic dispute between the two legal systems as to what a ruler was allowed to do. The de Brose family was let go, but only after the elder son had died of typhoid fever in prison. Okay, and as you can imagine, all the other noblemen were absolutely up in arms about this. They thought, well, what happens if I dispute my tax bill? And it was largely because of that the habeas corpus got put in and that King John was forced to agree to it. And I think what's lacking in our current disputes with the European Union is some sort of similar cause célèbre. We've got the European arrest warrant. There have been a few cases that have sort of made it into the headlines over that. But my feeling is that because the vast majority of the leading politicians in this country actually want us to stay in the European Union, none of them are willing to take up a cause of transparent injustice and fight it and force the issue with the European Union. And that in itself would, if you like, bring public opinion behind leaving the European Union and getting the right result in a referendum. So I think you're absolutely right, but I think Ted's quite right as well, that leaving the European Union is absolutely essential if Britain is to chart its own course. Once we have left the European Union, then I would imagine the majority of people in this room would be wanting to chart one sort of course for the future of Britain, and the majority of people who attend Labour Party conferences would want to chart a different course forwards. But that will then be a decision for Britain to make. I think you're absolutely right. Just leaving the European Union won't solve all of our problems, but it is necessary to do that in order to make a start.
First step.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman in front as well.
Right, thank you very much. I want to take this a little bit further, is that you've been speaking about
state bodies effectively do this. I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Australia a few years ago, which I think illustrates problems that can arise. Now, under the Australian Constitution, certain rights are preserved for the states and certain for the federal government. One of the rights reserved for the states was looking after the natural habitat, forests and so on, which is fine, dandy, it went on for 100 years. And then the Australian government goes and signs an international treaty, which is a right preserved for the state, the federal state, called Kyoto, affecting carbon emissions. At which point, the Australian federal government turns to the state of Tasmania, where you might notice there are a large number of forests, saying, actually, you've got to stop chopping down those trees, interfering in a local state responsibility. Now, the response of Tasmania was to immediately return a load of Conservatives to Parliament. That's a different story. The issue I'm getting at here is that you've got an organisation which has no responsibility to anyone. It's not even a state body. It's just a bunch of politicians meeting in Kyoto or Stockholm or somewhere, who come up with a load of regulations which then get imposed and actually put a load of people in Tasmania out of their jobs virtually overnight through no decision themselves.
I'll take that one first, if I may. We are meant to be talking about trade and Magna Carta, so let's look at it from that point of view. Back in those days, and looking at the feudal interrelationships that Europe had, there were very few actually sovereign states in Europe, a lot fewer than people think. You draw Magna Carta in this and the other. In theory, there were probably only about a dozen sovereign monarchs in Europe at the time. I mean, a lot of them behaved as if they were independent, but legally they weren't. Whereas, looking at today, there are 190 countries in the world, something of that number. 5. Okay, so looking at trade, let's take the World Trade Organization as being this international body that you're talking about. All the different countries of the world can choose whether or not to join the World Trade Organization. They can choose whether or not to sign up to the various agreements that the World Trade Organization is trying to push forward. Now, I would argue that the World Trade Organization generally is a force for good, and generally it's in favour of free trade, and therefore generally it's in the interest of a country to sign up. But should a country decide that, you know what, the World Trade Organization is trying to stop cobalt mining, and we've got lots of cobalt mines, so we're not going to join, they are free to do so. And I think what's coming out of Magna Carta on this, but in a very hazy sort of a way, is the King of England being one of these very few actual sovereign monarchs within Europe at the time. It was up to him to decide what to do. And the reason why this is written into Magna Carta is because they wanted the King of England to do it. And they recognised that the King of England had the power to do it. Okay? Whereas at the moment, people in, let's say, Albania, the Albanian government can take similar measures within WTO, and they have the power to do that. The British government doesn't, because this is one of the powers we've handed over to Brussels. And so, if this were to be brought forward to today, British merchants could say all they like about getting David Cameron to sign a bit of paper saying all merchants may enter or leave England unharmed and without fear, and David Cameron might sign it and it wouldn't be worth the paper it's written on, because he doesn't have the power to do it, because Brussels does. And I think one of the things that Magna Carta can teach us on this is that when you're trying to get a reform through, when you're trying to get something done properly, you do need to go to the person who's got the power to do it.
You're at serious danger of getting a lecture from me on the American federal system and treaty law, et cetera, et cetera. So I will restrain myself with great effort and simply point out 2 considerations. First, if folks in the room don't know why Senator Cruz is a leading presidential candidate in the United States, it's because as the Attorney General of Texas, he fought and won America's most significant treaty law case in the last 100 years, which was on precisely the point of national versus state responsibility under the Constitution, and the state point of view won. That's what made him a national figure, that's what got him into the Senate, and that's what's made him a credible candidate to be president. So this is a big issue in the States with big consequences. The point I would go back to Magna Carta on, it's easy to look at the society of Magna Carta and say that it's got nothing to do with our own. And in a lot of ways, that's perfectly reasonable. But Magna Carta is based on the idea that there are levels of responsibility in society, right? The king has a certain sphere of responsibility. There are nobles that have a certain sphere of responsibility. There are merchants that have a certain sphere of responsibility. And obviously our understanding of precisely what those roles and responsibilities are is very different. But the idea that there should be different levels of society with different kinds of obligations and different kinds of duties, and that one level shouldn't trench on another unless there is some process. It shouldn't, as the Australian case or the US-Texas case, it shouldn't just happen willy-nilly. That's a very important idea. And the essence of Magna Carta was to try to preserve English society, culture, and politics as the kind of place that had a lot of levels. So just because they're not our levels doesn't mean that that principle is not a really valuable one. And I think it's the essence of a lot of what Burke writes. Burke says a lot of very wise things about the difference between England and France under the Revolution, but one of the essence of his criticisms of France under the Revolution is that the French revolutionaries are destroying all pre-existing social institutions. In other words, they're knocking out all the levels. There's a huge divide between people who think that levels are good and levels are a problem. And by and large, it's the left who thinks levels are a problem because levels are a way of restraining and restricting things that historically the left has wanted to do. So naturally they resent them. So I think in that sense, Magna Carta is incredibly relevant to today, not for its precise content, but for this social idea that it represents.
How did the Habeas Corpus Act of 1688, I think it was, differ from, as you're describing it in Magna Carta?
Okay, the 1688 one really just sort of codified it a bit further than the Magna Carta one. The Magna Carta is quite vague about it. No man may be in prison without lawful trial. No one will we deny justice. And the problem with a lot of medieval stuff is that they knew what they meant when they wrote it down, and we don't necessarily know what we mean now. It was basically just bringing it up to date, putting it in language that people in the 17th century could understand, in much the same way that, of course, if you read the 17th century English, you'll find the odd word and you think, what the hell does that mean? And so, these things do need to be modernised from time to time. There wasn't really any substantial difference. It was just sort of making it a bit clearer, and I think restricting it. I think there was actually a time limit for the first time, wasn't there, 1688? I think. Okay, all right, none of us can quite remember, but I think there was.
quite remember, I don't think you'll help. Nonetheless, any further questions? Gentleman.
King John reneged on Magna Carta as soon as he could, and it didn't go into statute until some time later, in a revised form. Now, I can't tell you exactly how many. You can probably tell me how much of it actually remains as part of statute to this day. I believe it's very little. And how relevant, especially to trade, are those provisions?
Okay. Which was raging at the time when King John did the, in my view, pretty much the only good thing he ever did for the Kingdom of England, which is when he died suddenly. In the wake of that, the crown then went to his young son, Henry III. I think he was only about 8 at the time. And one of my great heroes from history, an elderly knight who was well into his 70s at this point, called William Marshall, who was highly respected by everyone. He decided that, well, enough is enough. And he stepped in and said, look, we've got to sort this out. And effectively sat down with the 1215 Magna Carta and crossed out the bits that he thought any sensible king would probably object to. And then what was left went through. So the revised Magna Carta, which is the one that actually did get into statute and remained in force for centuries, is the William Marshall version of about a few years later. And basically what he'd taken out were the constitutional innovations, which was giving political power to the barons and taking it away from the king. But all this sort of stuff, you know, the rights of merchants, the rights of widows, and all that sort of stuff, that all remained in. So I think the if you like, the essential heart of Magna Carta that we would both approve and celebrate remained in the later versions, and I think that's where its real importance is.
There are 3 clauses, if I'm correct, that survive in today's statute book. Liberties of the City of London, position of the Church of England, and habeas corpus.
Yeah, I think that's
No,
right.
it wasn't the Church of England, because at that time, the Church of England...
But it's part of, yeah, the liberties of the church. So we're what, 300 years before Henry VIII here. So
Yeah.
yeah, position of the liberties of the church.
Always good to heckle from Freedom Association. It's a very good informed heckle, I think, is a good way. But there's a gentleman at the back, I think, is a final question.
Yeah, the point I would make is, as well as Magna Carta, we've got to think about the Petitioner Rights Act that came in after the 30 Years' War. I just wondered if you've got any comments on the Petitioner Rights Act that came after the 30 Years' War under Charles II, I believe.
Any comments from the
I
panel?
think, isn't this the, sorry, I think you're referring to, oh God, the document Charles II had to sign before he was allowed to come back and be king.
Correct,
That's
yeah.
the one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, that document it was enshrining quite a lot of the sort of things that are in Magna Carta, but it was also addressing a lot of the problems that had led to the English Civil War, in which Charles II's father, of course, had ended up being executed. And that was about King Charles I, again, trying to introduce to England a foreign concept of kingship and government. He was trying to introduce what was then a sort of a new theocratic theory, which I think had come out of France originally, I think, of the divine right of kings. And Charles I had been holding that because of this divine right of kings, his rights trumped the rights of the citizen or the subject. Where, of course, you know, Magna Carta was saying, well, everybody is subject to the law. The king can change the law, but while it's law, he's still got to obey it like everyone else. And so the document you're referring to, I think, reiterated very much everything that's in Magna Carta, and then added a few others, which were very specific things that had tried to do, and saying, well, look, you know, you've got to promise not to do what your dad did, or we won't let you back in. But again, you know, we're in the same situation. Most of it's been repealed since then, and it's the 1688 one that I think is the one that actually remains in force more or less intact.
I mean, I would just add on the closing note. I would just add on the closing note that so much of this matters because there's a sense of narrative and history behind it. I mean, there is Magna Carta is very unlike the Bill of Rights in the American context, because the rights and privileges in some respects might be sort of a easier word to get across, but the rights and privileges that Magna Carta celebrates are justified as not coming from, in the as they do in the American context, from nature's law and, you know, God of nature. They exist because they've existed before. Now, that's not necessarily fully true, but it's convenient to say these kind of things. And of course, Magna Carta becomes one element in a story that gets told, and Magna Carta gets celebrated more and more. And maybe the one thing I would slightly take issue with you in your early remarks on is that just because a thing isn't perfect or isn't quite right by our way of thinking doesn't mean that it doesn't make a contribution to a narrative that has tremendous value going forward. And of course, there is a tremendous amount of change over, you know, 800 or so years, naturally. But the narrative is still a narrative of real value, and it's a narrative of real value because people value the parts of the narrative.
Yes.
And if you start throwing bits of it away by saying, well, you know, the computer hadn't been invented in 1770, 1789, so therefore the First Amendment doesn't really apply to anything but printing presses. Pretty soon you don't have a whole lot left.
Yeah, no, quite right.